What you are about to realize in the next 15 seconds is that social media addiction has nothing to do with weak willpower, boredom, or poor discipline, and everything to do with the fact that your brain is being quietly trained, rewired, and exploited by systems designed to hijack your attention, distort your sense of reality, and keep you emotionally dependent without you ever consciously agreeing to it. Because the moment you open an app, your mind enters an environment engineered to override your instincts while convincing you that you are still in control. The most dangerous thing about social media is not the time you waste on it, but the way it reshapes how your brain experiences reward, meaning, and self-worth. Because every like, notification, comment, view, and scroll activates the same dopamine pathways responsible for survival behaviors like eating, bonding, and seeking safety. And once these pathways are repeatedly stimulated in artificial ways, your brain begins to crave digital validation with the same urgency it once reserved for real-world connection. What most people never question is why opening social media feels automatic, almost reflexive, because the truth is that your brain has been conditioned to associate boredom, discomfort, loneliness, stress, and silence with the promise of relief. And social media offers that relief instantly, cheaply, and endlessly, creating a loop where your mind learns that the fastest way to escape discomfort is not reflection, action, or connection, but scrolling, which slowly weakens your ability to tolerate stillness, frustration, or emotional depth. What makes this conditioning so powerful is that social media does not give you consistent rewards, because instead of predictable outcomes, it offers intermittent reinforcement, meaning sometimes you get attention, sometimes you don't. Sometimes a post performs well, sometimes it disappears into silence, and this unpredictability is exactly what locks your brain in, because the dopamine system responds most strongly, not to guaranteed rewards, but to uncertain ones, which is why you keep checking, refreshing, and returning, even when the experience leaves you feeling empty. The hidden psychological trap is that your brain interprets social feedback as social survival, because humans evolved in environments where status, inclusion, and approval determined access to resources and protection. And social media exploits this wiring by turning attention into currency, visibility into value, and engagement into perceived worth, meaning every interaction subtly trains your mind to measure its importance based on external signals rather than internal stability. Over time, this rewiring creates a dangerous dependency, because when your sense of worth becomes tied to numbers on a screen, your emotional state becomes unstable, fluctuating with engagement levels, comparison, and visibility. And without realizing it, you begin outsourcing your self-esteem to algorithms that have no interest in your mental health, only in how long they can keep you engaged. What intensifies this addiction is comparison, because social media does not show reality but highlights, moments, filters, and performances. And when your brain is repeatedly exposed to curated versions of other people's lives, it begins to believe that happiness, success, beauty, confidence, and fulfillment are constantly happening everywhere except where you are, creating a quiet sense of inadequacy that drives you to scroll more in search of reassurance while simultaneously deepening the feeling that you are falling behind. Your brain is not built to process thousands of social comparisons a day, because for most of human history, you compared yourself to a small group of people within your immediate environment. But social media exposes you to endless standards, endless achievements, endless lifestyles, and endless ideals, overwhelming your nervous system and making contentment feel unreachable. Because no matter how much you have, there is always someone displaying more. What makes this psychologically exhausting is that your brain never fully relaxes on social media, because every scroll carries the possibility of judgment, validation, rejection, envy, or affirmation, keeping your nervous system in a low-level state of alertness that feels normal over time, but slowly drains your emotional energy, concentration, and capacity for deep focus, leaving you restless even when you are doing nothing. The illusion of connection is what keeps you trapped, because while social media gives you constant exposure to people, it rarely gives you emotional nourishment, and your brain confuses visibility with belonging, interaction with intimacy, and engagement with connection, meaning you can feel socially saturated while being emotionally starved, which creates a loneliness that scrolling cannot solve, but continuously aggravates. What no one warns you about is that constant stimulation weakens your brain's reward threshold, because when dopamine is released too frequently through effortless digital rewards, real-life achievements begin to feel dull, slow, and unrewarding, making reading, working, learning, building relationships, or pursuing goals feel disproportionately difficult compared to the instant gratification of your phone, which quietly reshapes your motivation system without your consent. As this imbalance grows, your brain begins resisting effort, patience, and delayed gratification, because it has been trained to expect stimulation instantly, and this resistance shows up as procrastination, lack of focus, mental fatigue, and a sense that everything meaningful requires too much energy, even though the real problem is that your reward system has been overstimulated and undernourished by shallow inputs. What makes social media addiction so difficult to break is that it disguises itself as productivity, connection, entertainment, and self-expression, allowing you to justify excessive use while ignoring the subtle psychological cost. Because unlike substances, there is no clear moment where you feel too much, only a gradual erosion of attention, depth, and emotional presence that becomes noticeable only after it has already taken hold. Your brain begins to crave distraction the moment discomfort appears, because social media has trained it that escape is always one swipe away, and this reduces your tolerance for boredom, silence, and introspection. Even though these states are essential for creativity, emotional regulation, and self-awareness, meaning the more you scroll, the less capable you become of sitting with your own thoughts. What is most unsettling is that social media addiction does not feel like addiction while it is happening, because it feels like choice, habit, or relaxation. And by the time you realize how dependent you are, your brain has already adjusted its baseline expectations for stimulation, making disconnection feel uncomfortable, empty, or even anxiety-inducing, which keeps you returning not for pleasure, but for relief. This is where the real danger begins, because once your brain associates being offline with discomfort and being online with relief, the relationship reverses, and instead of using social media as a tool, you begin using it as emotional regulation, relying on it to soothe anxiety, fill emptiness, distract from pain, and validate existence, which gives it psychological power over you without you ever consciously surrendering it. What you are experiencing is not weakness, but conditioning, because your brain has learned patterns based on repetition, reward, and emotional relief. And unless those patterns are interrupted, understood, and consciously reshaped, they continue operating in the background, influencing your mood, focus, relationships, and self-image, while pretending to be harmless entertainment. And the most unsettling truth is this: social media addiction does not steal your time first. It steals your attention, and once your attention is fragmented, your thoughts weaken, your emotional depth shrinks, your identity becomes externally defined, and your ability to be fully present in your own life begins to fade. setting the stage for the deeper psychological consequences that most people only notice when they finally try to stop. What happens next, once social media has trained your brain to crave constant stimulation, is that your sense of time begins to collapse, because the platforms are designed to remove natural stopping cues, meaning there is no clear ending, no conclusion, no moment that signals completion. And without these boundaries, your brain drifts into a state of continuous consumption, where minutes dissolve into hours while your awareness slowly disconnects from the present moment. This distortion of time is not accidental, because your brain enters a mild dissociative state while scrolling, where attention narrows, self-awareness fades, and the outside world becomes secondary, allowing you to remain engaged longer than intended while feeling strangely numb yet restless, a combination that keeps you scrolling, not because you are enjoying it, but because stopping feels uncomfortable. What deepens the dependency is that social media slowly replaces internal emotional regulation with external stimulation, meaning instead of processing emotions like boredom, sadness, anxiety, or insecurity, your brain learns to mute them instantly through distraction, which prevents emotional resolution and causes unresolved feelings to accumulate beneath the surface, making you more dependent on scrolling the next time discomfort appears. Over time, your mind begins associating emotional discomfort with urgency, because every negative feeling now demands immediate relief. And since social media offers fast distraction, your brain chooses it automatically, weakening your ability to sit with emotions long enough to understand them, resolve them, or grow from them, which is why many people feel emotionally stagnant despite constant engagement. What most people don't realize is that this avoidance subtly reshapes personality, because when emotions are consistently bypassed rather than processed, your emotional depth shrinks, your tolerance for complexity declines, and your responses become more reactive and less reflective, making it harder to engage in deep conversations, sustained effort, or meaningful relationships that require patience and vulnerability. Another layer of control appears when algorithms begin predicting your behavior better than you understand it yourself, because every like, pause, replay, comment, share, and scroll speed teaches the system what captures your attention, what triggers emotion, and what keeps you engaged, allowing content to be optimized not for truth, growth, or value, but for emotional provocation. This is why outrage, fear, insecurity, envy, and controversy spread faster than calm or nuance, because your brain is more alert to emotional threats than neutral information, and platforms exploit this by feeding you content that subtly dysregulates your nervous system, keeping you emotionally activated while convincing you that you are simply staying informed or entertained. As this continues, your baseline emotional state shifts because constant exposure to emotionally charged content keeps your stress response slightly elevated, meaning your body remains in a low-grade fight or flight mode that feels normal over time, but slowly drains your energy, focus, and emotional resilience, making restlessness feel permanent and calm feel unfamiliar. What is particularly dangerous is that social media addiction fragments attention, because your brain becomes accustomed to rapid context switching, short bursts of novelty, and constant interruption, weakening its ability to sustain focus on one task, one idea, or one conversation, which explains why reading feels harder, work feels heavier, and silence feels unbearable. This fragmentation does not only affect productivity, but identity, because when attention is scattered, self-awareness weakens, and without sustained attention, your mind struggles to form coherent narratives about who you are, what you want, and what matters, leaving you more susceptible to external influence, trends, opinions, and emotional manipulation. The more fragmented your attention becomes, the more dependent you are on external signals to guide your thoughts, emotions, and decisions, which is why trends shape beliefs. Viral opinions feel persuasive, and group outrage feels personal, because your brain is searching for structure in a landscape where its internal compass has been dulled by constant stimulation. Another subtle shift occurs in how your brain experiences reward, because effort-based rewards lose their appeal, while effortless digital rewards dominate, making activities that once felt fulfilling now feel slow, boring, or unrewarding, even though they offer deeper satisfaction. Because your dopamine system has been recalibrated to expect frequent, low-effort stimulation. This recalibration creates a dangerous loop, because the less rewarding real life feels, the more attractive social media becomes. And the more you scroll, the less capable your brain becomes of enjoying real-world experiences, reinforcing the belief that fulfillment exists online rather than in your own actions, relationships, and growth. What intensifies this dependency is identity performance, because social media encourages you to curate, edit, and present versions of yourself for approval. And once your brain begins associating validation with performance, authenticity becomes risky. Silence feels like invisibility, and worth feels conditional on engagement. This pressure to perform creates internal tension, because your online identity begins influencing how you think, speak, and behave offline, making you more self-conscious, comparison-driven, and approval-seeking, even in moments where no audience exists, which quietly erodes self-trust and internal confidence. As this continues, your brain begins confusing attention with importance, because what is seen feels valuable, and what is unseen feels irrelevant, pushing you to prioritize visibility over meaning, reaction over reflection, and speed over depth, which reshapes not only how you consume information, but how you define success and relevance. What is most unsettling is that the longer this pattern continues, the more normal it feels, because the brain adapts quickly to stimulation and imbalance, making addiction invisible while it is active and only obvious when you attempt to disconnect and feel anxiety, restlessness, emptiness, or boredom surge unexpectedly. This discomfort during disconnection is not withdrawal from pleasure, but withdrawal from constant regulation, because your brain has forgotten how to soothe itself without stimulation, leaving you face to face with unprocessed emotions, unmet needs, and internal silence that feels unfamiliar and threatening. What you are experiencing is not failure, but exposure. Because when the noise disappears, what remains is the emotional residue social media helped you avoid. And until that residue is addressed, the urge to return will feel powerful, automatic, and justified. The most important realization at this stage is that social media addiction is not about content, but conditioning, because your brain has been trained to seek relief, identity, stimulation, and validation externally. And unless that training is consciously reversed, the dependency will persist even if platforms change, trends shift, or new apps replace the old ones. And this is where the addiction becomes most deceptive, because it convinces you that you are choosing it, when in reality, your brain is following patterns it learned quietly, repeatedly, and without resistance, setting the stage for the deepest psychological consequences yet to come. At this stage, the most profound damage of social media addiction begins to surface, because the brain no longer uses these platforms merely for stimulation or distraction, but starts using them to construct identity, meaning, and belonging. And once this shift occurs, your sense of self becomes increasingly shaped by external feedback rather than internal understanding. When identity is built in an environment governed by metrics, visibility, and reaction, the brain learns to equate being seen with being valued. And invisibility begins to feel like emotional erasure, causing silence to feel threatening rather than peaceful, and pushing you to remain present online, even when you have nothing meaningful to say. This psychological pressure creates a constant background anxiety because your mind begins anticipating how moments will be perceived rather than how they will be experienced, turning life into content and presence into performance, which quietly distances you from your own emotions while keeping you mentally tethered to imagined audiences. As this continues, your brain starts editing itself in real time, filtering thoughts, reactions, and expressions based on how they might be received, which weakens authenticity and replaces it with strategic self-presentation, making it harder to know whether you are acting from genuine desire or from conditioned expectation. What makes this particularly destabilizing is that approval becomes inconsistent because engagement fluctuates unpredictably, and this unpredictability creates emotional volatility, where confidence rises and falls with attention levels, leaving you vulnerable to mood swings that feel internal but are driven by external data. Over time, the brain begins interpreting low engagement as rejection because social feedback activates the same neural circuits as physical exclusion, meaning silence online can trigger feelings of unworthiness, invisibility, and self-doubt that feel deeply personal, even though they are algorithmically produced. This repeated exposure to perceived rejection subtly reshapes self-image, because the mind searches for explanations, often concluding that you are not interesting enough, attractive enough, successful enough, or relevant enough, reinforcing insecurities that existed long before social media, but now feel constantly validated. What deepens the damage is comparison, because your brain measures itself against carefully curated identities, filtered bodies, edited lifestyles, and selective success, making ordinary life feel insufficient and progress feel invisible, even when growth is occurring in ways that cannot be captured by metrics. As comparison intensifies, your brain begins internalizing unrealistic standards, pushing you toward constant self-improvement, not out of curiosity or joy, but out of fear of falling behind, creating a relentless pressure to optimize yourself in ways that never feel complete. This pressure often spills into relationships because when validation is sourced externally, emotional presence weakens, making interactions feel transactional rather than connective, and conversations become opportunities for affirmation rather than spaces for understanding. Social media addiction subtly teaches the brain that attention equals love, which distorts expectations in relationships, causing disappointment when real people cannot offer constant engagement, instant responses, or endless affirmation, even though these demands are unnatural and unsustainable. As a result, intimacy begins to feel demanding because real connection requires patience, vulnerability, and emotional labor, which contrast sharply with the effortless stimulation of scrolling, making withdrawal from relationships feel easier than engagement. What emerges is a paradoxical loneliness, because while you are surrounded by content and people, your emotional needs remain unmet, and the brain confuses stimulation with connection, leaving you socially saturated yet deeply isolated. This isolation is often misunderstood because it does not come from lack of interaction, but from lack of depth, and without depth, the nervous system never fully relaxes, keeping you in a state of emotional hunger that scrolling cannot satisfy. Another shift occurs in how your brain processes meaning, because constant exposure to trends and viral narratives shortens emotional memory, making experiences feel disposable, replaceable, and fleeting. which weakens your ability to attach significance to moments that are not publicly validated. This erosion of meaning makes life feel fragmented, because without sustained attention and reflection, experiences do not integrate into a coherent sense of self, leaving you with a collection of moments rather than a narrative, which deepens feelings of emptiness and disorientation. As this fragmentation grows, your brain becomes more susceptible to external influence, because when internal grounding weakens, outside narratives feel stabilizing, allowing opinions, beliefs, and values to shift rapidly based on exposure rather than reflection. This is why outrage spreads quickly, identities polarize, and nuance disappears, because emotionally charged content offers clarity in a chaotic internal landscape, even if that clarity is artificial or divisive. What makes this particularly dangerous is that emotional manipulation becomes normalized, because when the brain is constantly stimulated, its threshold for impact rises, requiring stronger emotional triggers to feel anything at all, pushing platforms to deliver more extreme content. As a result, your nervous system becomes desensitized, making subtlety feel boring, patience feel exhausting, and calm feel empty, which reduces your capacity for emotional regulation and deep satisfaction. Over time, this desensitization makes real-life challenges feel overwhelming, because without constant stimulation, your brain struggles to generate motivation internally, leading to apathy, restlessness, or chronic dissatisfaction. What you may not realize is that this state benefits the system, because a restless, comparison-driven, externally validated mind is easier to influence, easier to monetize, and easier to keep engaged. The most unsettling realization is that your sense of self may feel less like something you own, and more like something that reacts, responds, and adapts to digital environments, leaving you unsure of who you are without the feedback loop. This is why disconnection feels like loss rather than relief, because stepping away forces you to confront an identity that has been partially outsourced, requiring reconstruction rather than simple withdrawal. And this is the point where many people return to scrolling, not because they want to, but because they do not know who they are without it, which is the deepest form of psychological dependency. The final stage of social media addiction is not dependence on the platforms themselves, but dependence on the version of yourself that only seems to exist when you are being observed. Because once your brain has learned to associate attention with existence, being unseen feels like fading, and fading feels like danger, even when nothing is actually wrong. At this point, the brain begins confusing stimulation with aliveness, because moments without notifications, updates, or engagement feel flat, empty, or unreal, leading you to unconsciously seek digital input simply to confirm that you are still present, still relevant, still connected to something larger than your own thoughts. What makes this so difficult to escape is that the brain frames this dependence as normal, because everyone else appears to be doing the same thing, creating the illusion that constant engagement is not only acceptable but required. And once a behavior becomes culturally reinforced, questioning it feels unnecessary or even antisocial. This normalization hides the fact that your nervous system has been trained to remain externally oriented, meaning your attention constantly points outward rather than inward, leaving little space for reflection, emotional processing, or self-generated meaning, which are essential for psychological stability. When attention lives outside of you, your emotional center weakens because instead of regulating your mood internally, you rely on stimulation to shift how you feel, making your emotional state fragile and easily influenced by trends, headlines, reactions, and content cycles you do not control. Over time, This fragility creates anxiety, because when your emotional balance depends on something external, uncertainty increases, and the brain responds to uncertainty by seeking more information, more reassurance, and more stimulation, reinforcing the loop that keeps you scrolling even when you want to stop. What most people interpret as lack of discipline is actually nervous system dysregulation, because a brain that has been trained on constant novelty struggles to settle into stillness, and stillness begins to feel unsafe, unproductive, or pointless, even though it is where clarity forms. This is why silence now feels heavy, because without stimulation, your mind becomes loud, replaying unresolved thoughts, unmet needs, and suppressed emotions that were never processed, because distraction always arrived first. Social media did not create these emotions, but it delayed your encounter with them. And once the noise fades, the backlog surfaces all at once, making disconnection feel overwhelming rather than liberating. The brain interprets this discomfort as a sign that you need to reconnect, when in reality, it is a sign that your internal systems are waking back up after prolonged avoidance. What determines whether the cycle continues or breaks is whether you misinterpret this discomfort as failure or recognize it as recalibration, because the brain resists change even when change is healthy. Recalibration feels worse before it feels better, because dopamine systems need time to reset, attention needs time to stabilize, and emotional awareness needs time to rebuild. And during this phase, the absence of constant stimulation feels like loss, even though it is actually space. This is the moment where many people relapse into scrolling, not because the platforms are irresistible, but because they are familiar. And familiarity feels safer than uncertainty, even when familiarity is harmful. What makes recovery difficult is that social media addiction does not have a clear endpoint, because the goal is not abstinence but conscious use, which requires awareness, boundaries, and emotional honesty rather than simple avoidance. To regain control, the brain must relearn how to generate reward internally through effort, presence, creativity, learning, and real connection, all of which feels slow at first, because your dopamine threshold has been artificially raised. This slowness is not a flaw, but a signal that your nervous system is re-entering a human pace rather than a machine-driven one. As attention stabilizes, something unexpected happens, because boredom reappears, and boredom is uncomfortable only because it has been misunderstood. Since boredom is not emptiness, but the space where curiosity, imagination, and insight emerge. When boredom is tolerated rather than escaped, the mind begins producing its own stimulation, restoring creativity and intrinsic motivation that scrolling quietly suppressed. At the same time, emotional regulation improves, because instead of bypassing feelings, you start experiencing them fully, which allows resolution rather than accumulation, making anxiety feel less urgent and sadness less overwhelming. Your sense of self slowly shifts back inward, because when validation is no longer constant, identity stops reacting and starts forming, allowing you to rediscover preferences, values, and desires that were drowned out by external influence. Relationships deepen because presence returns, and without the pressure of performance or comparison, connection becomes quieter, slower, and more real. What once felt like isolation begins to feel like peace, because the nervous system learns that silence is not absence, but safety. The most powerful realization is that social media never stole your attention, because you gave it willingly while believing it was harmless. And once you see the mechanics clearly, the illusion loses its grip. This awareness does not require rejection of technology, but mastery over it. Because tools lose power when their influence is understood, rather than unconsciously absorbed. What ultimately frees you is not deleting apps, but reclaiming agency over your attention, emotions, and identity. Because when these return to you, the platforms become optional rather than necessary. And the final truth is this: social media addiction does not mean you are weak, broken, or incapable of focus, because it means you are human in an environment designed to exploit human psychology. And once you stop blaming yourself and start understanding the system, control begins returning to where it always belonged, which is inside your own mind. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.